It's Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for December 30th, 2024, and I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us, everybody, for this conversation. I'm very excited to dig into it, but first I want to say a welcome back to the lovely Brennan Cassidy. If you listen to our Nosferatu episode, one, thanks for enduring that. At least on the video side, on the audio side, everything was perfectly fine. You wouldn't have known. On the video side, we did have some technical issues. I'm going to talk about that in some detail on the main show this week if you want to hear a really crazy story around that. But part of the story is that Brendan was gone because my man here succumbed to the darkness and had a temperature of 104. The rats got him. He
suffered the Black Plague.
Yeah. And so he missed that episode, and it was sad that he was not able to join us in that conversation. So I'm glad that you are here. You have somewhat recovered.
You can't really. You can really hear it in my voice right now. I'm basically singing bass at the moment. So it's good to be back, but huge thank you to Will for filling in for me. You guys had a great discussion on Nosferatu.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, that was a really, really fun review. I do urge people to go and check that one out. Nosferatu, it certainly stirred up some great conversation, and there's been plenty of discourse. We had to add our input into it, I guess, and we had a great time with that. We are now here to talk about James Mangold's latest, A Complete Unknown. And correct me if I'm wrong here, Brendan, but from what I know about this film is that they did an incredible job of making a whole movie based off of a cameo that we see at the end of Inside Llewyn Davis.
I mean, we all know Inside Llewyn Davis is the greatest music biopic of all time.
Exactly.
Right? So
it's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I love that. And, Inside Llewyn Davis, I would argue, is one of the best films of the 21st century so far. And
top 3 Coen Brothers films at worst.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And at the end of that film, as Llewyn is making his way out the door there, we get a little intro from a character that they call Bob Dylan. And James Mangold, being a big fan of Inside Llewyn Davis, decided, I'm going to write a whole movie about that little cameo, which I think is an inspired choice.
It's a very inspired choice.
To take a little cameo and make a whole movie out of it. It's very Hollywood, but I totally get it.
Well, yeah, because we've got the Greenwich Village cinematic universe basically happening here. And I can totally understand why James Mangold was inspired by that cameo in Inside Llewyn Davis, because that cameo provides probably just as much substance as this 2-hour movie does, as we'll talk about.
It makes sense, I think, from that perspective. Yeah, I mean, we will certainly get into perhaps some issues we have with The Complete Unknown. And I think my biggest complaint of the film, spoiler alert here, no Llewyn Davis. Does not show up once in this film. Severely disappointed.
I mean, every movie needs a Llewyn Davis, right?
Yes. At least one cameo of Llewyn Davis. It should be required by law.
That'd be the strangest law, but I would be here for it. To just see Llewyn Davis pop up to sing a song in every Hollywood movie ever made.
Yeah, imagine watching The Batman and randomly in the middle of that film. Look at Oscar Isaac.
Imagine if the Doof Warrior from Mad Max Fury Road was not playing a guitar with flames, but it was Llewyn Davis singing Fare Thee Well.
Amazing. I want that movie so bad.
I want that version too.
I mean, come on. George Miller, if you're listening, we have struck gold here. You need to re-envision Mad Max one more time.
A partnership.
One more time.
Yeah. Max and Llewyn Davis teaming up in the apocalypse.
I want that so bad. I want it so bad.
Yeah.
At any rate, we're here to talk about A Complete Unknown. Obviously, the biopic, sort of, yes, no, around one Bob Dylan, starring Timothée Chalamet. All right, before we get into it, let's go ahead and offer up a little pretext, as we tend to do. A couple of different avenues, similar to what we did with Nosferatu. I want to know your thoughts on James Mangold, and I want to know, especially as the music guru of the two of us,
Oh, sure, yeah.
your relationship with one Bob Dylan.
I mean, as the musician here of In Session Film, I mean, if you're a musician, if you're a songwriter in any way, you have to be influenced by Bob Dylan in some way. Even if you're not directly influenced by his work, you somehow are, because maybe he was the greatest storyteller in all of rock and roll. I think that could be the biggest argument you can make for him. I will admit, when it comes to the folk music scene in general, there are other artists I tend to gravitate more towards. Folks like Joni Mitchell, maybe Simon and Garfunkel, Nick Drake, to name a few others. There's just more of a there was more going on there that I was able to gravitate towards musically, as opposed to someone like Bob Dylan. What's interesting with Bob Dylan for me is, as we'll talk about with A Complete Unknown, when he really started to alienate his fan base by quote unquote going electric. That's the era of his work I like the most. Even though it's going beyond what the traditionalist dubbed as the right kind of folk music, I actually think Bob Dylan's album Highway 61 Revisited is his best work. Even though that is the one that sort of turned that corner and
kind of makes you the target audience for this film.
Well, it kind of does. I mean, that's it's a portion of this film. It's probably a good 40% of this movie is that particular avenue of his life. And the movie does cover a pretty small sliver of his life. It's not a full life story like most of these biopics, which in and of itself is pretty refreshing, as we'll talk about. But him going electric and that reaction is a big part of it.
Gotcha.
So, yeah. But that's the era of his music I actually found the most interesting to me musically. I like what he was doing there. So Bob Dylan, definitely an overall fan, and I appreciate him as a songwriter. As I guess with regard to my relationship to James Mangold as a filmmaker, I think he's one of the more reliable directors in the Hollywood sphere. I don't always love his work, but he's usually someone you can count on to get the job done. He's a very efficient, get the job done kind of filmmaker. He's made some movies that I think are indeed great. I think his best movie is still 3:10 to Yuma. I love that film. I think that's a great film.
Okay.
And a few others that I do think are genuinely fun, like Identity, and some of his earlier films like Copland, I think are very efficient. It's been a while since I've seen movies like Girl Interrupted. I think I've only seen Night and Day once and didn't really care for it. Admittedly, I think one of his worst movies is Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. But I think that's less of a Mangold problem, more of a Disney problem. I think maybe that's where his reliability as a filmmaker wasn't quite able to, I guess, overcome the Disney machine and the Disney dictatorship, if you will.
Sure.
But I think he's a reliable filmmaker. He's made some films that I do indeed love. I don't love all of his films, though.
Yeah, I guess since we're talking about Mangold, I'll just note that, like you, I do think that he is mostly efficient as a filmmaker, but he does have some really good films here. I hate to sound basic and vanilla here, but I do think Logan is his best work. For me, it's not even close. I
didn't even mention those because I knew you were going to talk about those. Yeah.
The very best superhero films ever made, if you even want to classify it as that. It almost bucks the genre in many respects, but
yeah, one of his better films for sure.
Really, really good. I do agree with you though. 3:10 to Yuma is fantastic. Maybe where you and I differ the most here is the Dial of Destiny. I don't think it is a great film by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it is maybe a little over criticized because a lot of people do talk about it as being one of the worst films of last year. And I really cannot go that far. And it's such an interesting conversation. And this is a slight rabbit hole I didn't really mean to get into. But
yeah, it's all good. It's all good.
But like in comparison to, let's say, Spielberg's third Indiana Jones film, Spielberg is a much better craftsman. It's not even close. Not
Sure.
even
Yeah.
close. But I think Dial of Destiny is a better movie despite being not nearly as sharp from a craft level, where the Spielberg Alien film, if you will, I think is remarkably crafted, but doesn't really work as a movie. So like when you
Yeah.
kind of look at it from that prism, I do prefer Dial of Destiny because I do think it works better as a movie, and he's trying to. Basically, he's going back to the Logan well. It's the same formula in terms of like trying to show reverence and deconstruct the character in a different way that we hadn't really seen before. So I like the approach, I guess is what I'm trying to say. I think he comes into his movies with the right approach, but the execution isn't always there. That is where I land on Mangold. He's an efficient filmmaker. He can get the job done. I think fundamentally he has the right ideas. They just don't always land for me.
You know,
if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. And I think you're hitting on something that I've always felt with James Mangold as well. We often talk about filmmakers who don't always write their scripts. Some of them are only as good as their scripts allow them to be. Someone like Ridley Scott, for instance, right? I don't know if James Mangold falls into that specific camp, but I think he is only as good as his producers and his production company allow him to be. And I think that's the case with something like Dial of Destiny, which is why it didn't fully work for me. I felt like he was really restricted because I felt very little of James Mangold in that movie. For most of that, it felt like it was directed by AI. I think like the first half of Dial of Destiny feels very visionless in many ways. Even though I think by the end, there is an emotional core that feels like, okay, this is Mangold now finally trying to imbue this film with some Logan-like energy. And I started to feel that. It just happened to come too little too late. Because even so, like, while I say a movie like that feels very visionless, I do think James Mangold ultimately does have a style. You watch all of his films, I do think there's consistency there. I see a movie like A Complete Unknown, I could sense, okay, this feels like it was probably directed by the same person who gave us Ford v Ferrari or 310 to Yuma or even Logan. I could sense
Walk
some
the Line,
similar
obviously.
Walk the Line, obviously, which we'll certainly have to acknowledge Walk the Line as we talk about A Complete Unknown further. But I can definitely sense that there is a consistency in style and tone with his movies. And that's where he's also very reliable. I guess it just depends on when those above him allow him to, make that reliability, make it come true, right? And I guess that's where he might be more pigeonholed, depending on what that property is that he's working within.
Yeah, I mostly agree with that. I mean, I walk out of his films not every time, but most of the time satisfied to some degree or another. They're outside of Logan, they're not making my top 10 at the end of the year, but I do enjoy a lot of them.
Sure.
There are a few that I haven't seen in a while, like you noted earlier. Girl Interrupted I haven't seen in a really long time. Night and Day I haven't seen in a long time. But, again, like walk out of that going, that was a fine little movie. So that's again, outside of a few exceptions, and really it's that 2017 to 2019 time frame where I think he really thrives. Logan and Ford v Ferrari, I think, are really great. And 310 to Yuma, I guess I'll give him some credit there. Those are easily my top three. Easily.
Yeah, and I know you and I slightly differ on the Wolverine, which I also really like. But I think to your point, there was a phase there from 310 to Yuma, maybe through Logan and Ford v Ferrari especially, where I felt like we were seeing that turning point in James Mangold that we've seen in other filmmakers when they start to turn a corner and begin to take themselves and the world takes them more seriously, right?
Yeah.
I think we started to sense that a little bit. And I guess we're still kind of sensing that with A Complete Unknown, given the Oscar prospects of it. People are really taking this film very seriously. You and I will offer our thoughts as to whether this film is deserving of that kind of praise. We'll get to that. But yeah, he definitely seems to have turned a corner. People do take him more seriously now.
Yeah, very much the case. Before I quickly give some thoughts on Bob Dylan, I do want to correct myself. I believe I noted Crystal Skull as Spielberg's third Indiana film. Obviously, I meant fourth. That is the fourth film.
I was
in
going to
that
say, there's
franchise.
no way you were talking about The Last Crusade with that. But you were on a roll. I just kind of let you roll with it.
Look, I'm not great with math, but I think we all knew that I was talking about Crystal Skull. When I referred to it as Spielberg's Indiana Jones alien film.
I think that pretty much gave it away.
Pretty much gave it away.
Numbers, schmumbers, whatever.
Man, numbers, yeah. As for Bob Dylan, what's interesting? I do have to credit Inside Llewyn Davis. We joke about it a lot. I do genuinely love that film with every fiber of my being, and that is the film that got me into folk music. I've listened to that soundtrack a gajillion times, but outside of that, it's inspired me to really delve further into that genre. And honestly, that's when I started to listen to Bob Dylan in a real way. I mean, obviously you knew of Bob Dylan, you knew some of his more famous works, but I didn't really pay attention to him in any sort of real way or that style of music in general, to be perfectly honest with you. So it's still not a genre that I'm an expert in by any stretch of the imagination, especially when compared to someone like Brendan. But I'd say that's when I really started to become more familiar with not just him as an icon in terms of American iconography, but as a poet, as an artist, how influential he became. It was around that time where I started to delve more into that. So my familiarity with Bob Dylan is still in its infancy, I would say.
But still, I guess you would safely say your favorite folk artist of all time is Llewyn Davis, right?
Yeah, hands down. Yeah, not even close. An American hero, a true American hero, Llewyn Davis.
yeah, that's fair. That's fair. Sometimes we need to take the fictional ones because they're deserving of that spot.
They are, absolutely. All right, let's get into this. A Complete Unknown is directed by James Mangold. It stars one Timothée Chalamet, as well as Edward Norton, Elle Fanning, Monica Barbaro, Boyd Holbrook, Scoot McNairy, and a few others that come and go throughout the film. In 1961, an unknown 19-year-old Bob Dylan arrives in New York City with his guitar and forges relationships with music icons on his meteoric rise, culminating in a groundbreaking performance that reverberates worldwide. Okay, let's jump into this.
Yeah, you end these plot synopses with such intensity. A lot of times they're more intense in the movies themselves that we're talking about.
I appreciate it. I'm trying to set the mood here.
Yeah,
you would try and get us into the right tone.
You would think that JD here was a theater guy, and maybe you aren't. I just don't know it.
No, I mean I love the theater, but I'm not theatrical. If that makes sense.
I don't know. You fooled me many times,
or at least I do my best to maybe give the facade of theatricality.
Well, you're convincing me. So again, you make a good actor, I guess.
I appreciate it. What did you think about The Complete Unknown?
So I think with this movie, we're going to be constantly talking about the music biopic curse, if you will. So many movies nowadays, music biopics specifically, fall under this Wikipedia style storytelling. And for those watching on YouTube, I'm putting quotes around that because it's something that many critics, not just us, but many critics, probably even outside of us, have actually coined that term. I can't say we're the ones taking credit for that, but we've definitely used it.
We've used it for years and years.
Yeah, but many critics have. It's a common complaint with biopics in general. But I feel like it has become more common with music biopics, especially after the success of Bohemian Rhapsody. It became more of an egregious thing that people have taken note of. So it's definitely something we have to talk about. And A Complete Unknown, and absolutely does fall into that category, I think. Even despite it only taking place over the course of what I think was maybe 5 or 6 years. So it is still ultimately a sliver of Bob Dylan's life and not his full story, which I do appreciate. But I don't know, man. I I did not expect another standard Wikipedia-style music biopic to be my pick for the biggest head scratcher of the year. And yet here we are. Because honestly, I can't tell if A Complete Unknown is one of the better or most egregiously awful examples of this tired genre. I honestly don't know. It's because on one hand, even though it does only take place in this sliver of Dylan's life, the film also quadruples down on all the things we often criticize music biopics of doing wrong.
Yeah.
This is basically nothing more than a sizzle reel of the folk music scene in 1960s. It actually feels incomplete. I feel like the movie doesn't even feel finished. It actually feels like
an incomplete unknown.
It's an incomplete unknown. Absolutely. No, I mean, like, seriously, the movie actually reminds me a lot of how we felt coming out of Napoleon, knowing that there was going to be a longer cut.
Yeah.
This feels like a movie that's begging for a director's cut. It really does. We'll also talk about the musical scenes. There are a lot of them. This is absolutely a musical. It's hilarious how it was not nominated at the Golden Globes for comedy or musical when Walk the Line was. It's just, I think it's hilarious. I will say, I think the musical sequences are not very good here. Even though there are a lot of them, I like that there are a lot of them, but they're all kind of the same, which we may talk about later. Here's where I'm stumped about this movie, though. Because while I think it quadruples down on the things we don't like these music biopics to do, I feel like the commitment to that formula feels strangely deliberate. And it makes me think if this approach was ultimately the point, in order to show Bob as some enigmatic figure unsure of how to comprehend his own success. Because Bob Dylan doesn't really feel like much of a character here at all. He feels like this wandering spirit, this idea of the insecurities that come with instant success. And maybe Mangold's goal was to take that tired framework to make something kind of dreamlike and mystifying about the deception of fame. And if that's the case, I can at least respect that. I don't think the movie works in either direction, but I think if it is the latter, it's a different and more interesting avenue to take if you're going to stick within this tired formula. So I'm kind of at two ends of the spectrum here. I think the movie is not good at all, or it's an okay version of this tired genre. But I can at least respect if it is that okay version of this tired genre by being more of this mystifying depiction of fame without much character to it, which is an interesting approach, I think.
Yeah. Where I ultimately land on this film, and you are right, there is a lot to dissect here as to what works and what doesn't. I think this is a really fun concert film. And I use those words deliberately. This is a really fun concert film because narratively it is thin. It falls into a lot of those biopic trappings that you're talking about. But it makes up for that by featuring a musical number every 45 seconds. Every 45 seconds, there is new music introduced. I may be being a little facetious, but there is a lot of music.
You're not wrong. You are not wrong.
We seriously don't go but a few minutes before the film features some sort of music from either Dylan or Barbaro or Seeger, or as we hear in one scene, Johnny Cash as well. And look, I get it. When you have someone as poetic and talented as Bob Dylan, you want to feature as much of it as you can. And when you couple that with the film's Wikipedia storytelling, it comes off more like a best hits or a sizzle reel, as you noted, but like a best hits concert album than it does a story about the man behind the music. I do think Timothée Chalamet is really great here. There's really nothing for him to chew on dramatically. He's just asked to become Bob Dylan, and I think he's very successful at doing so. Yeah, but that does have its limitations, which is why I think the film just leans into the music because it is great. And Chalamet is mesmerizing as a musician in this film. They notably sang and played everything live to camera, and that inherently has an organic energy that is entrancing. The camera work and editing may not be anything memorable inside of those musical sequences. But as
Right.
far as the music and performance goes, there is a lot of fun to be had with this film. And that to me is where it has its power. And I think the supporting cast is really great at heightening that as well. Monica Barbaro was really good. Elle Fanning, I think, gives a lovely performance. Boyd Holbrook is having the time of his life as Johnny Cash. And Edward Norton, I think, is probably one of the lesser performances here, but I also
Yeah.
like what he does bring, given what this script is, and what that character is supposed to provide.
Sure.
So yes,
Yeah, he's a
dramatically,
device. He's a device here.
he's a device. However, that is to say, dramatically, narratively, this film is awfully vacuous. But as a concert film, a movie that features a musical number every, if not 45 seconds, every 90 seconds, and that is much less facetious.
You're not wrong. And yeah, whether it be on the stage or in the studio, there's a lot.
Yes. Yeah. And I think as a concert film, I think it is diverting enough. I think it succeeds well in that regard. But as a movie, as a dramatic movie, it's not great. I don't think it's.
Yeah.
I don't think it's very good. It's very thin. Which, to your point earlier, how this didn't get nominated at the Globes for musical is asinine. It is insane.
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
That it doesn't land in.
It's insane. I would be able to agree with you on the praise you're giving it as being a quote unquote concert film if I didn't find the musical scenes themselves so samey. I found them kind of perfunctory, if I'm being honest.
That's fair.
Yeah, because you can kind of make a drinking game for how many times the camera slowly inches on Chalamet, only to then cut to a member of the crowd gawking at his genius. I mean, that's basically every musical number here. And the sameness of it, I think, is why I'm not able to even forgive it as a musical more so than anything else. I think if there was at least some variety, I would have been able to appreciate those sequences more. And even if they're performed a little bit differently, you have a moment in the studio when someone questions who wrote that, and his producer says he did, as if to suggest, this guy knows his stuff.
It's the writing there is not good.
It's like James Mangold. It's like if you're under the impression that we didn't know Bob Dylan was good at his job, then you're doing this movie wrong. I mean, that's kind of the problem I have with the musical scenes. But I like the idea that they're more abundant because I think it helps actually maybe defend the idea I mentioned earlier that this is kind of functioning as this enigmatic, mystifying, dreamlike scenario of sorts. Like, it doesn't really feel like a movie. But I will say, I think if it is going that route, it's only partially successful because I don't think Bob Dylan should have been the main character if you're going to do that. I think we should have had more observers take on that role and kind of see him as this enigmatic figure, which Bob Dylan was. The movie is called A Complete Unknown for a very specific reason, because he was a complete unknown. That's part of his ethos. So I do like that the movie is acknowledging that, but we've kind of seen that acknowledged before in movies like I'm Not There, the Todd Haynes film, or another different example, Don Cheadle's Miles Ahead did something very similar for Miles Davis. So we have seen these kinds of things before, but I like that this film is taking that approach for a character, for a figure that was ultimately a mystery. I don't know if the approach was even all that right, because I think Bob should have been more of a supporting player in that mystifying approach, if that makes sense.
No, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. I do think there is at least one moment here where I did find that formula kind of invigorating. Okay. And it's because it is a fusion of performance and music and the crowd reacting accordingly, as you're talking about. And then we get an insert shot that does layer in something really compelling. And it's the scene where Dylan plays at the Newport Folk Festival for the first
I
time.
knew that's the one you were going to say. Yeah.
And it starts off as this lovely duet between Dylan and how do you say her name?
Joan Baez. Joan
Baez.
Baez.
Okay.
Yeah.
Baez. And there's a cut to the crowd to emphasize how they are engaging with the performance, as you're talking about. That is a big part of the formula here.
Mhm.
And they are reacting in a significant way to this duet. And it's a great musical number between the two of them.
Sure.
And the performances there between Chalamet and Barbaro are fantastic. And then there's an edit back to Edward Norton's Seeger character. And this is where Norton and his prowess as an actor really comes to play. He's not given too much in this film, but what I love about Norton here is that he does a great job of denoting how momentous this is for him, because his dreams, something that he has envisioned for decades, is finally starting to come true.
Yeah.
That what he loves more than anything else in the world is starting to manifest right before his eyes. And it is dialogueless, which is probably why I love this moment, because again, it's all about performance, right? So
Sure.
again, it's about the musicians on the stage performing, and the music is great. The crowd is reacting, and you're letting Norton, become Seeger in a fascinating way that adds layers to this moment. That is eventually subverted as the film evolves, and we see Dylan wanting to transition to electric, as you're talking about, and we see the reaction of the crowd there and how they pushed back against that. And that ultimately gives this moment weight. This first time they're playing at the folk festival, it gives it weight in hindsight. And that to me is where the filmmaking, I think, is at its best, because you're letting the energy of the film tell the story. It is not about a Wikipedia note. It's not about moving the story forward in a sizzle reel kind of way. You're letting the camera and the actors tell this story. I loved that moment because of it. I wish there was more of it, and there really isn't.
There should have been a silent film. Or at least a dialogueless movie to emphasize that mystifying nature that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, because with a lot of the other musical sequences, they're either there just for the music, and we're not featuring music and story simultaneously like we do with this moment at the folk festival, or it's full of campy dialogue, such as when he's in the studio, as you noted earlier.
Yep.
There's a lot more of that than what I would argue is artistically driven scenes that combine the camera and the performance. But that one stands out because it is so distinctive from the rest of them.
You're right that there's a proper fusion going on, because in that moment when Dylan and Joan Baez are performing together, while we do get another one of those quote unquote insert shots of someone in the crowd absolutely gawking over this genius, right? And really these two geniuses, it does create a nice contrast for how people react to Bob Dylan's electric set. So there is ultimately a purpose in creating that sort of juxtaposition. And even though there is a bit of a distance between the two, it does kind of make you go back and think of, okay, there's a very traditional sensibility with how music was, that they're refusing to accept the evolution of music. And this can come with any genre. All genres, whether it be folk music in this case, jazz music, rock music, has gone through many evolutions and produced many different subgenres within their higher end genres. And at the time, when those forms of exploration were happening, those original fan bases were not pleased. They were not pleased at all. I mean, the same can be said about jazz music. When jazz, quote unquote, went electric, many jazz purists were not happy when, Miles Davis was releasing albums with electric piano as opposed to actual piano or electric guitar on it. People, they did not like that. They did not like that at all. And the same thing can be said about what Bob Dylan did here in, I think this was 1965 or 1966 when this particular moment in history was happening. but I like the way that visually this movie does capture that that conflict, that artistic conflict. It is probably the one moment where I thought, okay, there is something coming together here. It's just maybe 10 or 15 minutes of a movie that's already over 2 hours, sadly. and that's a big problem though.
Yeah, and that is ultimately the disappointment for me as well, because look, if you're going to have a movie that is flying by in terms of drama and the larger narrative, at least make the music engrossing. And at times it is, such as the early scenes at the Newport Festival. I think some of the introductory sequences, such as the first time that he plays for Scoot McNairy's Woody Guthrie character, like that's an interesting moment in this film as well. Because again, we're cutting back between, it's a little bit of what you're talking about of, especially with Norton Seeger realizing that this complete unknown is something special or potentially something really special. So you're injecting the formula, but that's the first time we see the formula acting out, and the music is really great. And again, where performance and music coalesce is with Scoot McNairy's reaction shots. Because again, it's a dialogue-less performance.
I actually think he gives the best performance in the movie. If I'm
he's really good. Like he's really, really good.
I was about to say that Monica Barbaro was the standout, but I actually think Scoot McNairy might be the standout now that I think about it.
He is really good. And so like that's a moment that works for me here as well. Or those early scenes in Greenwich Village, which aesthetically are a little similar to Inside Llewyn Davis. I did find myself geeking out a little bit there, if I'm being perfectly honest. But that might be more Inside Llewyn Davis doing the work than this film.
You cannot give Mangold credit for how this movie is shot up.
So, maybe it was a little nostalgic there for me. But he walks into the Gaslight, which is obviously music bar that is featured quite heavily in Inside Llewyn Davis. It looks aesthetically a little differently here, but it's a similar vibe, obviously. And you see Dylan going up there and playing a song. And I found that to be a little invigorating here as well. But as the film goes, to your point, it starts to regurgitate that formula without doing much to insert story. And because there's a music number every 45 seconds, it's going to be really difficult to tell this story.
Wash, rinse, repeat, and repeat, and repeat.
And the music is going to interrupt the larger narrative building. We're not using dialogue to convey Bob Dylan as a character. We're using music to do so. And if you're going to use music and the camera performance to tap into the soul of Bob Dylan, I think to our earlier conversation about James Mangold, he always comes in with the right ideas in mind. And I love that idea. Let's use performance and music and the camera to tell the story of Bob Dylan. We don't need him conveying exposition and talking about his life and where he comes from and who his parents are and how he ended up in New York. We don't need to know any of that, especially through dialogue. So I like the idea fundamentally, but I think the rinse and repeat sequence building, it does become a little tiresome, and it doesn't really do anything to add to Bob as a character. And I believe you noted that earlier, like he's almost a non-character here. I love Chalamet's performance, especially because Bob is, for the lack of a better term, he is an asshole throughout this entire film.
Sure.
And Chalamet really leans into that. I love the brazenness in offering the character up in that way. And Chalamet doesn't hide from that at all. He doesn't back down by any stretch of the imagination. So outside of that kind of coarse outer shell that he has, what else do we know about him other than that he's this grand poet? We don't really know anything. And maybe that is the mystery.
That's the thing.
Of
maybe
Dylan
we're not
is the
supposed
point.
to. And that's that's where I think the potential ideas of this movie, as you're talking about, are kind of fascinating. I don't think the movie is successful in exploring those ideas, but I
No, I
kind of
agree.
appreciate that these ideas are there, which is probably why I don't even know if I want to say this because I think I might get in trouble saying this. I'm sure you might not even agree with this as well. Um, I think I still prefer this movie over Walk the Line because it has those ideas that I think that film really just feels like an actor showcase. I mean, there's a reason why Walk Hard came about and made fun of that movie directly for targeting the tired music biopic tropes. Because Walk the Line,
Yeah.
outside of Joaquin Phoenix and Reese Witherspoon's great performances, I think that movie offers nothing. I think that movie is exactly everything that we criticize music biopics for nowadays. It just
Yeah.
happened to do it at a time when we weren't really criticizing those movies for doing that. It kind of predated this whole criticism. But I
Yeah.
think looking back, Walk the Line is kind of uh, the the founding member of this critique in many ways. Um,
Yeah.
at least this movie, A Complete Unknown, while it is suffering from the same things, I feel like it at least has ideas that it's trying to imbue this formula with to try to overcome it. I don't think
Yeah.
it's successful, but I think it at least has those ideas, which I can at least respect.
Well, I knew there was a reason we brought up the Indiana Jones rabbit hole earlier. It's not all in vain.
It's not.
Because I do think, at least for me, it might slightly differ for you, and that's perfectly fair.
Mhm.
But for me, I think that is actually a very apt comparison when we're talking about A Complete Unknown versus Walk the Line,
Okay.
in the sense that Walk the Line is very straightforward. It is the formula through and through. However, I think, given those constraints, I think that is one of the better versions of that style.
Okay.
I do think there's some emotion that comes through in that film, and a lot of it
It is kind of the
Joaquin
yin to
Phoenix's
this film's
sublime
yang in
performance.
many ways.
Yes, Reese Witherspoon is mesmerizing in that film as well. It is limited because of the formula, but for all of the films that engage with it, I think Walk the Line is one of the better versions of that formula.
That's
However, A
fair.
Complete Unknown is the Spielberg crystal alien film where it has maybe something a little bit more going for it, but isn't quite there as a movie, if that makes sense.
I think that
So,
no, yeah.
like, I honestly think that Indiana Jones comparison kind of, or more than kind of, I think it actually fits here
yeah.
quite well for me.
Are we gonna? Yeah, that's the thing. Are we praising the safer, successful version or the more ambitious failure? Like that's
Yeah,
kind
that's
of what
it.
we're talking about here. And I
Yeah.
do think A Complete Unknown is the more ambitious failure, which, as we've
Yeah.
talked about on this podcast many times, we kind of respect those ambitious failures. And
Yes.
now I feel like it's a bit of a stretch to call A Complete Unknown an ambitious failure in comparison to other ambitious failures when directors like
It's
Ridley
a
Scott
light,
are working. Yeah,
ambitious
it's a
failure.
light. It's an ambitious failure in the context of James Mangold's filmography.
Yeah. Yeah. The
Um,
Diet Coke version.
It's the Diet Coke version, less calories,
Yeah.
less sugar, less sweetness. But I think that's why I do slightly prefer it over Walk the Line. Even if I don't think it's a better movie, I appreciate those ambitions more.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly fair. And because I do like that it might be aiming for some sort of enigma with Bob Dylan and who he wants to be.
Mm-hmm.
And, that's certainly indicative of a lot of the choices he makes here. He doesn't really want to be in public, tries to stray away from it as much as he can. And also, he's not afraid to confront people that approach him with something that he feels is of yesterday. He continually wants to move forward, which is what makes some of those scenes that he has with Seeger really compelling, where, again, it ultimately ends in some sort of musical number because it's a concert film after all.
Yeah.
However, in those fleeting moments, even though he ultimately engages with the music and succumbs to what people want, there is some sort of pushback. And that is where Chalamet, I think, is really good because, again, there's nothing on the page for him to chew on.
Right.
He has to take these little light moments of drama or a line of dialogue, and he has to react in a way where he is doing what he's told most of the time until the end of the film anyway. Where he ends up playing the song at the party even though he doesn't want to, or playing the old hits on his first album even though he clearly doesn't want to. Like you see that in Chalamet's performance without the film having to feed us that. But that's not really there on the page. It's in these brief moments, these brief reactionary shots that I do really like. I guess I wish the film gave us more of that and giving more space for those scenes to breathe, because everything flies by here because we're off to the next thing, which I think is a little bit ironic when I hear James Mangold talk about how he wanted to avoid this being a cradle to grave biopic. I somewhat laughed at that because it isn't cradle to grave necessarily. It is what we often talk about in terms of, and you brought up some great examples earlier of taking a sliver of a person's life and emphasizing that. That is sort of here, but we're talking about when he shows up as a 19-year-old in New York City, and then he becomes this famous musician, and then we get to the sliver of moment time.
Honestly, it feels like what this movie is the act 2 of a Cradle to the Grave miniseries.
Yeah. I mean, it's so like, I think it is much larger than what James Mangold seems to think that it is. And I say that as a detriment because it is wanting to tell a grander version of Bob Dylan's narrative. Miles Ahead is always going to be the film I go to because it is such a perfect cipher for what this kind of movie could be. I think if this film really wanted to give some depth and nuance to the psyche and the mindset of Bob Dylan in 1965, focus on his life in 1965. We don't need to go anywhere else. If you want to give us a few flashbacks, that's fine. I could live with that.
Sure.
I think that is honestly one of the better aspects of Walk the Line when we start to figure out that relationship with him and his brother and how that kind of manifests in his adulthood. So yeah, if you want to give us a few flashbacks, you can live with that. But you focus on 1965 and what leads to this decision to go electric and why people are pushing back against that. Like, I think there's more room in the sandbox there than maybe what he thinks might be there. I mean, I don't know what they're thinking in terms of the origin of this screenplay, but it is larger than he thinks it is. It's maybe not cradle to grave, but it's not.
It still feels very cradle to grave. Yeah, that's the thing.
It feels cradle to grave.
It feels like which is why I think movies like Miles Ahead or even Love and Mercy are going to be the ones I cite as the best examples of the music biopic genre as of late. Like, let's say as of the 21st century. Blaze, the Blaze Foley biopic. A great movie. Earlier this year,
the Ethan Hawke one, Born to Be Blue.
Born to Be Blue. That's another great where he played Chet Baker. A great companion piece to Miles Ahead came out the same year as Miles Ahead.
Yeah, that's right.
That's kind of another yin and yang situation of a complete unknown in Walk the Line, because you have Johnny Cash in both movies, played by different actors. Yeah. Miles Davis was in Born to Be Blue, but not played by Don Cheadle. So nice little parallel there. I think that's a great companion piece. Or even earlier this year, Kneecap, the Irish film, a much more interesting music biopic film.
I agree. Yeah.
We're at a point where I'm sensing music biopics can actually get away with more experimental forms of filmmaking because their musical subjects were innovators. They were unique individuals. So the film should reflect that. And sadly, I just don't think James Mangold is that person. Even with an enigmatic figure like Bob Dylan, I appreciate the approach here. But I just don't think the execution's there, as we keep talking about.
Yeah, I completely agree. There's just no nucleus to this film outside of the music itself. And that can only take this so far as a movie. Again, as a concert film, I had a great time. I think the music is great. but that's the music carrying this, not the film itself.
Just go listen to his albums. Just go
Just
listen
go
to Highway
listen to his
61
albums.
Revisited. It's great. Opens
Yeah,
up with like a Rolling Stone. Might be his best song.
Yeah, exactly. And, because ultimately, because there's no nucleus here, dramatically speaking, or even from a character perspective, it just feels like these actors are playing dress up and giving impersonations. Is ultimately how this feels to me.
I do think Monica Barbaro does probably the most work in maybe going beyond just the imitation. Chalamet does at times, to your point earlier. But I think she's perhaps the standout as far as maybe providing Joan Baez with a sense of character outside of just the imitation. Now, Boyd Holbrook is just giving an imitation, but he knows he's just giving an imitation.
Yeah. He's having fun.
He's having fun. He's not asked to do anything more than just an imitation, and he's doing a great job at it and is having a lot of fun with it. But I do think just as far as an acting performance in a movie, Monica Barbaro and, as we mentioned earlier, Scoot McNairy, the two standouts for me.
Yeah. Yeah, they're really good. I do agree. And look, Timothée Chalamet is likely on his way to an Oscar nomination. He's not going to make a 5 for me, but
not me either.
I don't dislike, I do think he's really great here given the material.
Sure.
I really like what he does as far as offering up Bob Dylan as this mystery that no one can seem to figure out, especially Pete Seeger, and how that is ultimately lost on Seeger at the end, I think is great because of Chalamet's performance. And at times when he is able to react, as brief and fleeting as it is, I think Chalamet is able to give great depth to it. I just wish that if this film wanted to, in all of its provocativeness, maintain the mystery of Bob Dylan, to either give Chalamet more room to breathe when he's alone reflecting, or even when he's having conversations with others, to let the camera linger on him in some sort of way that doesn't reveal anything material, but maybe offers up some ambiguity as to what he may or may not be thinking in the moment. So, for example, and this is a very different film, but I think of those lingering shots in All We Imagine as Light, where the camera or something happens, a conversation, an action, and the camera just lingers on Prabha for 5 to 10 seconds. And you just get these heartbreaking moments of us being able to understand the heartache and the psyche of that character without dialogue. And those are really effective. I kind of wonder if Mangold gave us more like those kind of shots here without revealing anything that would give room for Chalamet to give an actual performance, but still maintain the mystery, if that makes sense.
Well, it makes sense. I just wonder, this idea of Bob Dylan as this mystery, this enigmatic figure, this wandering spirit that we keep talking about, if that was the goal, I do often wonder if there is something repetitive about that, given the fact that Todd Haynes' movie I'm Not There already exists, which kind of did it in its own way. And that's
true. That's also fair, yeah.
Yeah, and admittedly, that's a film I first caught up with not too long ago. That was a bit of a blind spot for me for a long time. I think I watched it for the first time maybe around the time that Todd Haynes released that documentary on the Velvet Underground called The Velvet Underground. That was 2021, maybe 2022 or something around that time. That's when I finally gave I'm Not There a first watch, and it's great. It's great.
It's really great, yeah.
Yeah, but going back to this overall point, if this was Mangold's goal, haven't we seen that before in another Bob Dylan-esque biopic? Like I feel like that it's a question that I think is worth asking.
Well, okay, and if that's the case, that I think what you bring up there is really, really apt. Then maybe you go to what we were talking about earlier in terms of letting the musical sequences, because again, this whole film is a concert movie.
It is. It is.
Then letting the music and the performances as these characters are on stage, letting that tell the story.
Yeah.
Such as the example we brought up earlier where he plays at the festival for the first time.
Mhm.
Like, if you have a whole movie of that and it's visual storytelling the whole way through, top 10 of the year, maybe. I mean, I think it had potential to be truly great.
You're right that this is basically a visual version of Bob Dylan's greatest hits. That's basically what this is.
That's all it is. And unfortunately, the execution isn't there throughout. In parts, for sure, but it's more redundant than it is invigorated.
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah. I'm with you. Yeah. It doesn't really work.
Yeah. I mean, and look, it is working for a lot of people. I've seen this on a lot of top 10 lists. I see a lot of people praising the film and Chalamet and offering him a best actor slot in their 5. And look, all of that is perfectly fair. I will go to bat for Chalamet here because I don't think it's his fault by any stretch of the imagination.
No, I think he's very good here. But yeah, to your point, he's not going to be in my 5 for the In Session Film Awards either.
Yeah, I think this is, again, it's Mangold coming in with some really great ideas and not able to follow through on them. That's where I land here.
Yep, I agree.
Unknown.
I agree.
Do you have any final thoughts?
Just listen to Bob Dylan's music. I guess in that case, just go listen to Highway 61 Revisited. Go listen to Blood on the Tracks, which Quentin Tarantino just recently talked about his favorite music, and I think he called that the greatest album ever made. So if you're a film fan that wants to get into music and you love Tarantino, go listen to what music he loves. He loves Bob Dylan. Yeah. So there you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and like I will, I think I mentioned this earlier in passing, but I'll reiterate. I do admire that the film is committed to depicting Bob Dylan as this prick the whole way through. There's really not much of a likable bone to the character in this film, and I love
him an asshole. I think it was Joe Baez that even calls him that very directly at one point in the movie. So they're not hiding it. You're right. They're not hiding it at all.
They're not hiding it at all. He treats people as lesser than, and maybe that's true to Bob Dylan. I don't know. And there is I think maybe that's where the whole inside Llewyn Davis thing comes through for me as well. Although you do get this in the Todd Haynes film as well. Although I think there's so much more nuance to that movie.
Sure.
But I do kind of appreciate that the character is very prickly. I do like that about the character. And I think Chalamet, again, commits to that in a really great, like at one point he just tells Joan that her lyrics are garbage, basically.
Yeah.
like straight to her face, does not hide it like at all. It's like, okay. Like I wanted more moments of that. Unfortunately we don't get a whole lot of it, but
I appreciate that, especially knowing that Bob Dylan's, still around to see this movie.
Yeah, absolutely. Or another aspect, someone brought this up on social media earlier today, that at the end of this film, you get Dylan playing the electric concert there at the end, all kinds of chaos. And we just get these insert shots of Johnny Cash just hanging out in the background, like just chilling. Not really. You have this iconic character.
This is fun.
It's just this iconic character who's had his own movies, obviously. Just chilling in the background, just literally not doing anything, just kind of pointing and winking at Bob Dylan. It's so funny.
I do love Johnny Cash as a figure and as a musician. I mentioned earlier a certain artist of that scene that I just appreciate. And while I would not call Johnny Cash a folk artist, he was really more of a classic outlaw country artist. He is one of my favorites. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I love him as a figure, love him as a musician, and I love what Boyd Holbrook brings to that.
Oh, he's
that
great.
sensibility.
Yeah, it's
like that sort of cocky exterior I really appreciated.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the cast here is not the problem for me. I think this is a James Mangold not knowing what to do with this film problem.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
Land on it.
I can agree with that. Like the ideas, don't like the execution, unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay. That's where we stand. If you agree or disagree, and again, based off the discourse, many or a lot of you, a fair amount anyway, might disagree with us. And that's perfectly fair. Leave a comment below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, reach out to us on the social medias, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Letterboxd. You can email us in sessionfilm gmail.com as well. As I noted, we have a review of Nosferatu up as well that you can go and check out. Thanks again to Will Bjarnar for joining us for that conversation. It was a really, really great time.
Yeah.
And stay tuned for the main show this week, episode 617. We have a lot more homework we're going to go through. We have a lot of films that we're going to talk about. We did this on last week's show for those that tuned in. And on this week's show, we have the documentary No Other Land, I'm Still Here, Seed of a Sacred Fig, How to Make Millions Before Grandma Dies, all kinds of movies. We have a bunch that we're going to go through, so be on the lookout for that. Now, very busy week, and I think there's going to be a new Chasing the Gold, a new Women in Session as well.
All right.
So, with all of that said, thanks everybody for listening, watching. Go listen to Bob Dylan. And we'll see you all next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Really wanted to like this movie.
How does it feel?